Hi, this is Simon Obstall and welcome to another tutorial for Resolve Fusion, and today we're going to be taking a look at creating this interesting 3D loader effect. Now there are loads of interesting techniques involved in this one, so let's make a start. So the first thing we want to do is to create our ring. So I'm going to make a 3D shape. I'm going to set it to torus. Let's have a look at that. So we want a radius of 1 and a section of 0.1. And then let's go for 60 base subdivisions, and we can reduce the height subdivisions down to 10 because we don't need that amount of detail. And then what we need to do is we need to rotate it so it's standing vertically. We can do that with an X rotation of 90 degrees. Just going to give that a little bit of color temporarily, just so it's not white. And I'm just going to set up a camera. So add a 3D camera, which automatically creates a 3D merge because I've got the shape selected. Let's add a 3D renderer and look at the output of that and just set up our camera. So let's go for 25 on Z. So then I'm going to add a basic animation to my shape. Come over to its transform, and I'm going to add an expression to the X. So that expression is going to be sine, S-I-N, open brackets, time, divided by 20, close brackets. And so that is now looking like this. It's very gently rocking backwards and forwards, and it's going between -1 and +1 in terms of its position. So then what we can do is, after that shape, we can add a 3D duplicate node. And we're going to have 16 copies. And in order to get our animation, we're going to add an expression to the X offset. So add an expression in there. And it's basically going to be the same as the one before with a slight variation. So sine, S-I-N, open brackets, time divided by 20, close brackets, times 0.4. And now if we run this, you can see that our Slinky animation is working very nicely like that. So the next thing I want to do is to set up its color, which is a slightly trickier operation. To do that, I'm going to create a background node to generate the color. The first one I'm going to set to blue like that. So let's just rename this as blue. Let's copy and paste it, rename this as red and make it red instead. And then paste it one more time. Call this one yellow, and let's make it yellow by zeroing out the blue, and let's have 0.75 for both the red and the green. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a dissolve node here, and I'm going to add the red and the blue to it like that. And I'm going to add an expression to the slider here. So right click, expression, and it's going to be a variant of the same expression. So sine, S-I-N, open brackets, time, and this time divided by 10. And if we look at the result of that, you can see we're slowly cycling between blue and red. So at this point, I have to let you know that I wasn't concentrating here and I didn't complete the expression. And although it's going to work, it's not going to quite look the way I intended it to do. So anyway, I'm going to come back to this at the end and fix it. And it applies to the next expression as well. So back to the tutorial. So then we need to add in the yellow. So we're going to add another dissolve node there. And we'll pipe the yellow into there. And let's just grab that same expression that we've already made. So that one there, off dissolve 1. And add an expression to the slider for dissolve 2, paste that in there. So what we want to do with the yellow is to have it offset in time from the other two, so it appears between them. So I'm going to put another bracket before time. After time, I'm going to type -10, and I'm going to close the bracket like that. And so now if we look at the dissolve, you'll hopefully see that we're cycling like this. And what we can then do is use that as the material, effectively, for the shape. Pipe that second dissolve into the shape there, and let's look at our renderer. And now if we press play, this isn't working as we would like because we actually want them to be out of phase. So what we actually want to do is come into our duplicate 3D here, and we need to manipulate the time offset. So we're going to have a time offset of 2 frames. And now that's going to look a whole lot better because we've spread that color cycling out across the animation like so. Now you'll notice that that's starting to slow down a bit, and what we can actually do is come into this renderer and switch it to hardware renderer, and depending on your setup that should just make it all a little bit smoother, and that's going to be absolutely fine for our purposes. So that was quite easy. We've set up our shape animation. I'm just going to actually put all of that into a group, so select all of that, Control G, and let's just call that group rings. So then let's actually talk about making the capsule that the rings are going to sit in. Now, we don't actually have a 3D capsule in Fusion, but we can make our own. So let's first of all add a 3D shape, and let's have a look at that. So we want to turn this into a sphere, and I'm just going to increase the base and height subdivisions to say 60 for both. We actually need quite a lot of resolution in this for it to render smoothly. So what we're going to do to create our capsule is we're going to add a custom vertex tool, this one here, and let's look at that. So what we're going to do is enter an expression for this X position on the custom vertex tool. So that expression is going to be if, open brackets, px is greater than 0, comma, px plus 12, comma, px, close brackets. And there you go, that's our capsule. So let's look back at that expression. So basically what it's saying is any vertices that are greater than 0, in other words, they're to the right of the center of the screen, add 12 to them, otherwise don't do anything to them. So anything that's less than 0 is being kept in its original position. But to every pixel that is greater than 0, 12 is being added. And that's giving us a nice capsule. Now, obviously, you'll notice the capsule is actually not now in the center of the screen, and we actually need it to be that. So I'm going to add a 3D transform. Let's look at that. And all we need to do is set that X translation to -6. So that's half the length of the capsule, and now it looks like that. Not too worried about where the pivot is, because we're not actually going to move the capsule, but you'll notice that it's actually still over there. But the capsule itself is in the center of the screen. So just very quickly, I'm going to give it a material and set its opacity down to say 0.4, so it's see-through, and maybe just sort of reduce the red down to nothing, so it looks like that. Then we can add a 3D merge after that, and we can add the camera to the 3D merge. So anything we do with the camera for the rings is going to be duplicated for the capsule. So then after this 3D merge, we can add another 3D renderer. And if we look at that, it looks like this. And then we can take our rings and we can merge them over the top of this other 3D renderer like that. And it looks like this. We want to set the alpha gain to 0 because we want this to be additive. And you can see the difference that makes. So you'll notice that our shape is a little bit too small. So we need to come back to it and we need to set its radius to 1.3. But what I also want to do is I want to kind of have an inner surface. So it's not just infinitely thin. And to do that, I'm going to add a 3D duplicate node after that transform in there. And 2 copies is good. And what we'll need to do is adjust the scale. But I need to unlock the scale first of all. So we're going to have 0.98 for the X and the Z, but for the Y, we're going to have 0.925. And hopefully you can see that's kind of more or less equalized it. If we had the same value for each, so 0.98 for the Y, you can see it's not uniform. So finally, it remains to kind of composite this and make it all look nice because it looks absolutely terrible at the moment. The first thing I think I want to do is add a background node and composite that merge over the top. So just drag that over there. And now we're against black. That's going to be better. So the first thing we need to do really is to set up some lights. But first of all, I want to come back into my camera so that I can easily rotate around this. So what I'm going to do is my usual trick, which is to add an expression to the Z pivot. And then I'm going to pick whip the Z translation. And I'm going to add a negative sign to the front of it. And what that will allow me to do is to rotate around like that using the Y, or indeed any of the other rotations. And we're rotating about the center of the world, and that's going to be a lot better. So while we're here, let's just set the Y position to something like -1 and just adjust that X rotation to something like 2 degrees. So we've got a slightly more interesting angle on everything. So what we need to do is we need to add some lighting, but we don't actually want to light the rings. That's why I've got these two separate renderers. So the rings renderer, you'll notice I haven't turned on the lighting, but we are going to turn on the lighting for the renderer for the capsule. And if we turn that on initially, we won't see anything. So let's just, first of all, add some lights to this merge here. So I'm going to add a 3-point light like that. And then we can indeed turn on the lighting for the renderer. And we just need to position this light. So I'm going to have -3 for the X, 1 for the Y, and 5 for the Z. And then let's copy it and paste it and also add this one to the merge. And let's move this one over to +3 instead. And let's also have a backlight. So copy and paste again, and the position for this is going to be 0 on X, 1 on Y is good, and -5 on Z, so it's behind. So let's come back to our shape and let's add a shader. So let's add a Cook Torrance shader and pipe it into the shape. And now the Cook Torrance is affecting the shading for the shape. Let's turn on two-sided lighting. This is going to be very important because we want to light the inside of the tube. And let's come to the diffuse color and let's turn it way down and let's give it a little bit of cyany blue, somewhere like that. Let's also come into the specular and let's set the roughness down to 0.2, and that's giving us a little bit more of that shine. And I possibly also want to adjust the color of this and again just make it not white. I think that just looks nicer when it's sort of complementary to the diffuse color. Now you'll notice we're getting kind of this speckling on the capsule, and I think what I want to do is after the renderer here is just add a blur and set the blur size to 2. And that'll basically just sort of help to anti-alias those edges, and we will see less of that nastiness. What I should have also done when setting up these point lights is to switch their decay type to linear and set the decay rate to something like 0.2 and do that for all 3 of them. And this is going to make a much nicer, more realistic effect. Linear decay, decay rate 0.2, do that for all 3 of those. So the key thing to this though is that we're going to be lighting inside the tube as though the rings are creating the lighting. So let's just come back to our camera and undo that Y rotation so we can sort of see it head on like this. It's going to be easier to set up these lights. So I'm just going to group those point lights again. So select all 3 and Control G like that. So then let's add in a new 3-point light and add it to that merge. Now it's not having any effect because it's at 0, so it's actually right in the middle of the tube, and that's because I forgot in my Cook Torrance to set that opacity for the diffuse. So let's come back in there and set that to something like 0.4, and now if I enable and disable that light, you can see the effect it's having. You can also see the nice double thickness that we've got going on the capsule. So what we're going to do with this light is we're going to set it to blue. And again, let's set the decay type to linear and decay rate to something like 0.2. And you can see we've now got a nice blue light in there. And what we need to do is we need to animate it. And we can do that using the same expression as before. So let's come over to the transform, add an expression to the X, and the expression was sin, open brackets, time divided by 20, close brackets. Now this is only going to move it left and right by 1 unit, and we actually want it to go 6 units. So what we're going to do is times 6. And you'll notice now that blue light is right over there on the side. And then if we run it, you'll see that the blue light is kind of more or less following the movement of the rings. Let's maybe just increase the intensity of this blue light a little bit, because blue is not very strong. So let's maybe go for 1.5 for the blue. So let's rename this light as point light blue, and then let's copy it and paste it. And let's make this a red light. So red like that. Let's rename that as point light red. And we need to adjust the position of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a multiplier of 3 for this. And again, red is not a very strong color. So let's bump up that intensity, possibly even to 4. Let's exaggerate that. And hopefully you can see that nice red glow in there. And again, that is kind of following along with the rings. And we need a final one for the yellow. So let's copy and paste, add it to the merge. Let's rename that as point light yellow. Let's set it to yellow. So let's go for 0.75 on the red and the green. And then let's come over to transform. And this time we don't actually want a multiplier at all, but just for tidiness, I'm going to set that to 1. So obviously multiplying by 1 does nothing, but at least we're kind of consistent in the way we're formulating that expression. And that's just going to move gently backwards and forwards across one unit. So now we've got a much more interesting effect because of what we've done with that internal lighting. So let's now come back to our camera and create an animation for the camera. So you'll remember that we were looking at rotating it on Y, and you can see how lots of kind of interesting stuff goes on when we do that. We're getting these nice sort of shines here and so on. So let's just enter an expression for the Y, and here we're just going to have time like so. Now, I don't actually want it to begin flat on, so I can actually affect that by adding to time. So I'm just going to add 16 frames to time, and now it's going to start slightly rotated. So it's rotated 16 degrees at the beginning. Just going to be nicer, I think, than if we were starting flat on. Now, actually, maybe I don't like the position of that camera. Let's just maybe try an X rotation of 4. And maybe that Y is a little bit too much. Let's go for -0.5. I think that's better. Okay, a couple of other things we want to do. One of which is to add a glow to the renderer for the rings. So there's that rings renderer. Let's just add a glow to that. And that already helps a lot. Let's increase that glow size, I think, to 20. And what I'd also like to do is to glow the capsule separately, or rather glow the highlights of the capsule separately. And that's the advantage of having these two different renderers. So I'm actually going to drop it in after that blur there that we used for the anti-aliasing. Drop it in here. Now, as you see, by default, it's kind of glowing everything. And we don't really want to be glowing the darker bits of the capsule. We just want to pick up the highlights. So what we can do is we can switch the apply mode to threshold, and immediately there you can see the difference that makes. And if we adjust this low threshold, we can even refine that even more. So it's only really the bright bits that get glowed. And I think that's a much nicer effect. So we're kind of picking up all these nice little shiny bits. And so the final thing I'd like to do is come back into this background here. And instead of a solid color, I'd like to go for a gradient. And I've already set that up in actual fact. I'm sure you know how to set up a gradient, so I won't waste your time talking it through, but I just wanted to point out how much nicer it is to composite against that than against black. We've got something interesting in the background, but it's not drawing too much attention to itself. So finally, I mentioned that I hadn't quite set up the color cycling for the rings quite the way I wanted to do. So let's fix that now. I'm going to come back to this rings group here, and I'm going to ungroup it just so we can see where we went wrong. So you'll notice that we've got an expression for this first dissolve here that doesn't quite work the way I want it to, and I want to explain what it's actually doing. So it's actually oscillating this value, not between 0 and 1, which is what I want, but between -1 and 1. So I've just done a little demo here to show you. So here I've got a green dot that's oscillating in that way. So here is the expression for that, you can see I've used exactly the same expression there. And you'll notice that it's not oscillating smoothly. There's a kind of a long period where it's black. So over on the right here is what it should have been. So this one is oscillating smoothly between 0 and 1, whereas this one is holding on black quite a long time. And that's because it's going negative, as you can see there. It goes fully negative, while this one stays positive because it's just going between 0 and 1. And the difference between those two is that with the good one, what we've done is we've multiplied it by 0.5, in other words, divided by 2, and we've added 0.5. And that's just kind of normalized the range so that it's going between 0 and 1. So let's actually copy that expression, and let's come over to this dissolve here and paste that in. So sine, open brackets, time divided by 10, close brackets, times 0.5 to halve the distance, and plus 0.5 to move it to the correct range. And so we need to do the same thing with this other dissolve here. At the end, we need to add times 0.5 and plus 0.5. And if we actually look at that color cycling, it's a small difference, but it's going to make quite a bit of difference to the way it actually looks. And the colors are going to be kind of in sync with our animated lights. So sorry about that. I think it's probably quite helpful to have explained that point in a little bit more detail anyway. So that's the finished effect. Hope that's been interesting. Quite a few techniques involved there. Thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.